Welcome to Daily Planning for Fruitful Living, bringing the hope of Jesus to the world around us, one fruit at a time. Hi, I'm Leann, and I'll be your host today. I'm so glad you're here. Today, we're going to learn a little more about the peace of God from Paul's letter to the Philippians. But before we get started, I'd like to ask a favor. Would you consider following us on Spotify? It's free, no obligation whatsoever. Simply search Daily Planning for Fruitful Living and choose to follow us for inspiring insights and practical tips on living the fruitful life for Jesus. So let's get started. Today, I'd like to introduce you to a couple of less than famous women in the Bible. They're mentioned very briefly, and if asked, they may not want to be remembered. Their names are Euodia and Syntyche. Paul writes about them in chapter 4 of his letter to the Philippians. He intentionally states that these women have worked with him to spread the good news. They have worked very hard as anyone. He thinks highly of their efforts and contributions to sharing the gospel and strengthening the faith community. He even makes note that their names are written in the book of life. He wants everyone to know these are good women. But that's not why he mentions them in his letter. Paul's letter to the Philippians is a letter of encouragement and instruction for living a victorious life for Christ. He's writing it from a prison cell, and yet it's full of joy. He shares with great passion and conviction that we can have joy in spite of our circumstances. He declares, "The joy from the Lord is our strength." The enemy wants nothing more than to steal our joy, and in doing so, steal our strength. There's an energy and a momentum in Paul's letter right up to chapter 4, when it's as if his mind wanders or gets distracted. And that's when our friends Euodia and Syntyche come in. They disrupt his thoughts and take over. It's so interesting to me. It's as if he just couldn't stop himself from speaking about them. Now, he hasn't seen these women for some time. After all, he's in prison, and he's writing this incredible word of encouragement and testimony of his own faith to the Philippians. And yet his thoughts go to Euodia and Syntyche, so much that he stops to address them individually in the middle of his letter. Why? What on earth could he be thinking? Paul stops to call them out. It's as if he can't continue without addressing them. Something they are doing is a distraction and a threat to the greater goal of making Christ known, the goal that matters most. He says, "Euodia and Syntyche, I beseech you." Some translations say exhort, urge, advise, entreat, beg, appeal, ask, pray, encourage, or implore. He says, stop arguing with each other. Be of the same mind. Agree. Work in harmony. Have the attitude the Lord wants you to have. Iron out your differences. Come to a mutual understanding. Work together in the Lord because you both belong to the Lord. Paul is just almost strenuous in his appeal to these women. They are so good and so impactful, and yet their work is being compromised. His thoughts and words of encouragement were so totally disrupted by the thought of these women, not for the good work that they were doing, but because of their inability to work together or in peace with one another. Their behavior was a total distraction and was working against all their efforts to make Christ known and advance the gospel. Paul couldn't even continue writing without addressing their behavior. We all know people like these women. They're hard to forget. They're the ones that disrupt family gatherings, team meetings, celebrations, gatherings of all kinds. No matter where they show up, it's always the same. They just can't seem to get along with others. You might call them disagreeable or oppositional. I call them joy robbers. Regardless, they disrupt and they distract. Sadly, they're hard to ignore, and very difficult to forget. They become known for their poor behavior, just like these two women we're reading about. We all have been to a wedding and somebody like this shows up, or a party, and before you know it, it's all about them. They've got the attention, and the whole event, the tone changes. And later, even years later, when we think back upon it, all that comes to mind is how these people totally ruined the event. Paul wasn't about to let that continue, and that's why he addresses them. And then he asks others to help them. And then, just as if business was done, he returns to his words of encouragement and instruction, only with an even greater zeal. He says, "Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice." You can hear his enthusiasm as he repeats his direction and adds an exclamation point. Paul knows the joy of the Lord is our strength, and it leads to peace. So he tells us, start with joy. Celebrate Christ first. We so often skip right over this verse. We get right to verse 6 that says, don't be anxious. And we skip this direction, and yet it's so critical. Paul says, rejoice. And then he says, and let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Let what's on the inside be seen on the outside. Let others know the Lord is with you. Then that's when he gets to the famous, do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your request to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. When I think back at this, after I read, rejoice first. Let your evidence be clear. Let your gentleness be evident to all. I don't read it as a directive, as don't be anxious. I read it more like when you rejoice in the Lord and your gentleness is evident and you acknowledge the presence of God. You don't need to be anxious. There's nothing to be anxious about. No need to be anxious. But if anxiety comes in and gets the best of you, in every situation, regardless, simply pray, give thanks, and present your request to God. And the peace of God will come and guard your heart and your mind. The joy of the Lord is our strength, and the peace of God is our testimony. When we become known by our peace, God's peace, the peace that surpasses all understanding, we make Christ known. It is the evidence of Christ living in us. Don't you love it? People see Christ when they see the peace of Christ in you. Do you need more of God's peace? Are you known for your lack of peace? Do this one thing. Follow Paul's direction, but start with step 1. Rejoice in the Lord. Start each day with a celebration of God and all his goodness. Let his joy rise up in you, and soon his peace will be followed